Right now, on the entire planet, there's exactly one species of human left. Just us. That might sound obvious, almost too obvious to even mention, but it's actually a strange, kind of unsettling fact once you stop and really sit with it. For most of the time humans have existed on Earth, we weren't alone. Multiple different human species lived at the same time, sometimes even in the same regions, sometimes probably even crossing paths with each other. And then, one by one, every single one of them disappeared until only one lineage was left standing. Us. So the question worth asking is a pretty big one. Why did every other human species go extinct while we somehow managed to survive? And is there something specific we did differently, or did we just get remarkably uncomfortably lucky? Let's start by setting the scene properly, because a lot of people don't fully realize just how crowded the ancient human family tree actually was. Homo sapiens, our specific species, is just one branch on a much larger tree that includes species like Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, and several others, depending on exactly how you count certain fossil discoveries that scientists still debate the classification of. At various points, several of these species existed simultaneously, sometimes overlapping in the same general regions for thousands of years at a stretch. This wasn't some brief, awkward overlap either. Neanderthals and modern humans, for example, coexisted for an extended stretch of time, likely interacting, competing, and in some cases, as we'll get into shortly, even having children together, which makes the eventual outcome pretty striking. Out of all these different human species, spread across different continents, adapted to different environments, only one made it through to the present day. Everyone else eventually vanished. So, what actually happened? Let's start with Neanderthals specifically, because they're by far the most studied and most well understood of our extinct relatives, and their story tends to overturn a lot of outdated assumptions people still carry around. For a long time, the popular image of Neanderthals was pretty unflattering. Dim-witted, brutish, hunched-over cavemen, barely capable of complex thought, easily outcompeted by smarter, more sophisticated modern humans who simply outthought them into extinction. It's a satisfying story in a way because it flatters us. But it's also, according to a huge amount of more recent research, largely wrong, or at least a serious oversimplification of what actually happened. Neanderthals had brains roughly comparable in size to modern humans, sometimes even slightly larger. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, likely had some form of symbolic thought or expression based on discoveries of pigments and decorative objects at Neanderthal sites, and there's growing evidence they may have engaged in intentional burial practices, suggesting some form of ritual or symbolic behavior around death. They successfully survived in harsh, cold European environments for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting physically and behaviorally to conditions that would be seriously brutal for a species without serious cognitive and technological sophistication. So if Neanderthals weren't simply dumber or more primitive than us, why did they disappear while we didn't? The honest answer, based on current research, is that it probably wasn't any single dramatic cause, but rather a combination of smaller disadvantages that added up over an extended period of time. Population size appears to be one significant factor. Genetic evidence suggests Neanderthal populations were likely much smaller and more scattered than modern human populations at the time, which would have made them more vulnerable to random population crashes, reduced genetic diversity, and slower recovery from environmental setbacks like disease outbreaks or extreme climate shifts. A smaller, more fragmented population is simply more fragile in the face of random bad luck, regardless of how capable individual members of that population might be. Climate change also likely played a meaningful role. The period during which Neanderthals eventually disappeared coincided with significant, repeated climate fluctuations across Europe, and some researchers argue that modern humans may have had certain adaptive advantages, whether behavioral, technological, or social, that allowed them to weather these fluctuations somewhat more effectively than Neanderthal populations managed to. There's also a competition angle worth considering, though it's important not to imagine this as some kind of dramatic, deliberate war between species. It was likely a much quieter, more gradual process, played out over thousands of years across shared territory. If modern humans and Neanderthals were competing for similar resources, similar hunting grounds, similar shelter locations, even small consistent advantages on the modern human side, slightly larger social networks, Slightly more efficient tools, slightly broader dietary flexibility could have compounded over an enormous number of generations into a meaningful demographic edge, gradually squeezing Neanderthal populations into smaller and smaller viable territories until they simply couldn't sustain themselves any longer. Now, here's a detail that tends to truly surprise people and honestly reframes the entire idea of Neanderthal extinction in a pretty significant way. Neanderthals didn't fully disappear in the sense most people assume. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, and as a direct result, most people alive today with ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry a small but measurable percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genome, which means, in a very real, literal sense, Neanderthals didn't vanish completely. They were, to some meaningful degree, absorbed into the modern human gene pool, their genetic legacy quietly persisting inside millions of people walking around today who have absolutely no idea they're carrying pieces of an entirely different human species inside their own DNA. This detail alone complicates the simple, clean narrative of one species outcompeting and replacing another. The reality seems to be a lot messier and more intertwined, involving competition, interbreeding, gradual population decline, and eventual genetic absorption, all happening simultaneously rather than as a single, clear-cut event with an obvious beginning, middle, and end. Let's talk about Denisovans next, because their story is honestly even stranger, largely because we know so much less about them directly, despite having surprisingly strong genetic evidence of their existence and influence. Denisovans are known almost entirely through a small number of fossil fragments, a few teeth and bone pieces discovered primarily in a single cave in Siberia, alongside genetic analysis of DNA extracted from these remarkably sparse physical remains. Despite this limited physical evidence, genetic studies reveal that Denisovans also interbred with modern humans. And certain populations alive today, particularly in parts of Southeast Asia and Oceania, carry a notably higher percentage of Denisovan DNA than populations elsewhere in the world. This raises a pretty fascinating question about how many other human species might have existed, interbred with modern humans, and left genetic traces behind, without us having found enough physical fossil evidence yet to even properly identify or name them. The Denisovan story is a solid reminder that our understanding of ancient human diversity is still incomplete, pieced together from fragmentary evidence. And it's entirely possible there are other extinct human lineages out there that contributed to our genetic makeup that we simply haven't discovered clear physical evidence of yet. Let's back up even further for a moment and talk about Homo erectus, because this species deserves real credit for something remarkable: sheer longevity. Homo erectus persisted for an almost unbelievably long stretch of time, roughly 2 million years by many estimates, making it one of the most successful and enduring human species in the entire fossil record, far outlasting how long modern humans have existed so far by a wide margin. Homo erectus spread across a huge geographic range, from Africa into large parts of Asia, adapting to a wide variety of environments along the way, using increasingly sophisticated stone tools, and, evidence suggests, likely controlling fire at some point during their extraordinarily long run. Given just how long Homo erectus successfully persisted, their eventual disappearance is worth pausing on specifically because it wasn't a case of a fragile, struggling species barely holding on before finally collapsing. It was closer to a wildly successful, long-running species gradually fading out, likely through a slow combination of climate shifts, competition with other human species including our own direct ancestors, and the ordinary pressures that eventually catch up with almost every species given enough time. There's something worth appreciating in that framing. Even a species that dramatically outlasted us so far in terms of sheer duration still eventually reached its own endpoint. A reminder that long-term survival, however impressive, doesn't necessarily mean permanent survival. It's worth pausing here to talk about how researchers actually pieced together stories this old and this fragmentary in the first place, because the methods involved are remarkably clever given how little physical evidence often survives across such enormous timescales. Radiometric dating techniques, which measure the predictable decay of specific radioactive elements within fossils or the surrounding sediment layers, allow researchers to estimate the age of remains with a reasonable degree of precision, even when dealing with material that's hundreds of thousands of years old. Ancient DNA extraction, a technique that's advanced dramatically over just the past couple of decades, allows scientists to pull genetic material directly out of remarkably old bone fragments, comparing that ancient genetic code against modern human DNA to identify interbreeding events, population size estimates, and migration patterns that would be completely invisible using fossil evidence alone. This combination of physical fossil analysis and genetic sequencing is really what's driven most of the major breakthroughs in this entire field over the past 20 or so years. The Denisovan discovery specifically is a perfect example of this in action, since an entire previously unknown human species was identified almost entirely through genetic analysis of a single small bone fragment, rather than through a dramatic, complete skeletal discovery of the kind most people probably picture when they imagine paleontological research. It's a solid reminder that some of the biggest, most significant discoveries in this field increasingly come from laboratories analyzing microscopic genetic material, rather than from dramatic excavation scenes involving carefully brushed-off skulls. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. It's also worth taking a moment to talk about what daily interaction between different human species might have actually looked like, since it's easy to picture Neanderthals and modern humans as living in completely separate worlds that only occasionally dramatically collided. The reality was probably far more mundane and gradual than that. Overlapping territories likely meant occasional encounters, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, sometimes leading to trade of tools, materials, or knowledge, and sometimes, as the genetic evidence clearly shows, leading to reproduction between individuals from different species entirely. This wasn't necessarily a dramatic, storybook romance across species lines. It was likely a practical, sometimes opportunistic reality of small, scattered populations occasionally crossing paths across shared landscapes over an enormous stretch of time, with genetic mixing happening as a natural byproduct of that ordinary repeated contact rather than as some singular, remarkable event. There's a particularly interesting wrinkle here worth mentioning, involving specific genes inherited from Neanderthals that appear to have provided real, measurable benefits to modern human populations. Certain genes linked to immune system function, for instance, appear to have been inherited from Neanderthal ancestry, and may have helped early modern human populations adapt more quickly to new pathogens encountered as they spread into unfamiliar regions and environments that Neanderthals had already been living in for a very long time. In a strange way, interbreeding with a species that had already spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to European conditions may have given incoming modern humans a genuine practical advantage, borrowing pre-adapted genetic solutions rather than needing to evolve those same solutions independently from scratch over many additional generations. That's a fairly remarkable detail once you sit with it. The very species that eventually disappeared may have directly contributed genetic material that helped ensure the survival and successful spread of the species that replaced them. Extinction and survival, in this specific case, weren't as cleanly separated as the word extinction tends to suggest. There was real genetic exchange and mutual influence happening throughout this entire extended process, right up until the point Neanderthal populations became too small and scattered to persist as their own distinct, separate lineage any longer. Let's shift to Homo floresiensis, sometimes nicknamed the Hobbit species due to its remarkably small stature, discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores. This particular species presents a notably different set of questions compared to Neanderthals or Denisovans, because it appears to have evolved in relative isolation on a single island, developing a much smaller body size likely as an adaptation to limited resources available in that specific island environment, a pattern seen in various other animal species that evolve on isolated islands with constrained food supplies. Homo floresiensis persisted for a remarkably long time in this isolated environment, and the exact circumstances surrounding its eventual disappearance remain less clearly understood compared to Neanderthals, partly due to more limited fossil evidence and ongoing scientific debate about precise dating. Some researchers propose that modern human arrival in the region may have played a role, whether through direct competition, disease transmission, or other disruptive effects that tend to occur whenever a new, more numerous population arrives in a previously isolated ecosystem. Others point to volcanic activity and environmental instability specific to the region as potentially significant contributing factors, independent of modern human arrival entirely. This uncertainty itself is worth acknowledging, because it highlights something important about this whole topic. We don't have complete, perfectly documented answers for every extinct human species. A lot of this remains actively contested scientific debate, pieced together from limited fossil evidence, genetic analysis, and educated inference, rather than a fully settled, universally agreed upon story. Now let's zoom out and ask the bigger question hovering over this entire topic. What, if anything, made modern humans specifically different enough to be the one lineage that survived, while so many closely related, clearly intelligent, clearly capable species didn't? One compelling factor that keeps showing up across multiple lines of research involves social networks and cooperation at scale. There's growing evidence that modern human populations, even in the deep past, tended to maintain larger, more interconnected social networks compared to some of our extinct relatives, exchanging goods, ideas, and genetic diversity across wider geographic distances. Larger, more interconnected populations tend to be more resilient against localized disasters, disease outbreaks, and resource shortages, simply because there are more potential sources of support, trade, and genetic exchange to draw on when things go wrong in any single location. A species with smaller, more isolated social groups, even if individually just as intelligent, may have simply been more vulnerable to localized catastrophes that modern humans could route around through wider social and trade connections. Behavioral flexibility likely played a meaningful role too. Modern humans appear to have developed a particularly wide-ranging capacity for adapting behavior, diet, and technology to an enormous variety of different environments, from freezing Arctic tundra to dense tropical rainforest to arid desert. This kind of broad adaptability, the capacity to adjust strategy dramatically depending on local conditions rather than relying on one specialized approach suited to a single environment, may have given modern humans a meaningful edge in surviving the kind of unpredictable environmental swings that likely contributed to the decline of more regionally specialized species. Symbolic thinking and complex language also come up constantly in discussions about what might have set modern humans apart. While there's compelling evidence that Neanderthals and possibly other extinct human species had some capacity for symbolic behavior, some researchers argue that modern humans may have developed a more extensive, more flexible form of language and abstract thinking, enabling more complex planning, more effective knowledge transmission across generations, and more sophisticated coordination within and between social groups. This remains a hotly debated area of research, since it's extraordinarily difficult to directly measure the linguistic or cognitive capabilities of a species that's been extinct for tens of thousands of years, but it's one of the more actively discussed potential explanations. There's a particularly striking piece of evidence worth mentioning on this front, involving cave art discovered in parts of Europe that has since been dated, using advanced mineral dating techniques applied to the rock layers covering the paintings, to a period predating the arrival of modern humans in that specific region. If that dating holds up under continued scrutiny, it would mean Neanderthals themselves were responsible for creating symbolic cave art, directly challenging any assumption that abstract, symbolic expression was somehow uniquely a modern human trait. Findings like this keep pushing researchers to reconsider just how similar, cognitively speaking, our extinct relatives may have actually been to us, rather than assuming a clean, obvious gap in capability that conveniently explains why only one lineage made it through. It's worth being honest about the limits of our current understanding here, too. A lot of what gets presented confidently in documentaries and articles is actually still very much contested among researchers who study this material professionally. The honest answer to why did modern humans survive while other human species didn't is very likely a combination of multiple overlapping factors: population size and resilience, climate adaptability, social network structure, and possibly certain cognitive or linguistic advantages working together over an extended period, rather than any single, clean, satisfying explanation that fully accounts for the outcome on its own. There's also something worth acknowledging about pure luck in all of this, uncomfortable as that might be to sit with. Even with real advantages in population size, adaptability, and social structure, modern human survival while other closely related species disappeared wasn't necessarily some inevitable, predetermined outcome written into our biology from the start. Small, random events, a disease that happened to hit one population harder than another, a particularly brutal winter that a specific group happened to survive while a neighboring group didn't, could have meaningfully tipped outcomes in ways that had little to do with any deep, permanent superiority on the part of modern humans specifically. We may be here largely because a long chain of small, unpredictable events happened to break in our species' favor rather than someone else's, repeated across tens of thousands of years. This is honestly a humbling thought once you actually sit with it. The story of human survival isn't necessarily one of clear, decisive triumph over clearly inferior competitors. It's closer to a messy, gradual, multi-causal process involving competition, interbreeding, environmental pressure, and no small amount of random chance, playing out over an enormous stretch of time until, eventually, only one lineage remained standing. Let's bring this back around to what it actually means for you, sitting here as a member of the one human species that made it through all of this. Your existence, and the existence of every single human alive today, is the end result of an extraordinarily improbable, complicated multi-species story involving direct ancestors who competed with, occasionally interbred with, and eventually outlasted several other closely related human species, each one capable of tools, fire, likely language, likely some form of symbolic thought, and in some cases even ritual and burial practices. They weren't primitive footnotes on the way to us, they were entire, fully realized branches of the human family tree, each one eventually reaching a dead end for reasons that remain, even now, only partially understood. And in an odd, quiet way, a small fragment of at least some of these vanished species is still walking around today, embedded directly in the genetic code of billions of people who carry Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA without ever realizing it. They didn't disappear entirely so much as get absorbed, diluted, and carried forward inside a species that eventually became the only human lineage left standing, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with as we wrap this up. If the survival of our entire species came down to this complicated mixture of population size, adaptability, social connection, and no small amount of unpredictable luck rather than some clean, inevitable march of progress, what does that actually suggest about how secure our own continued existence really is, going forward, compared to how permanent and guaranteed it probably feels from the inside?